Welcome everyone. My name's Barbara Monroe and I'm Chair of Compassion in Dying, and I'm also Chair of this webinar. This is one in our series called Important Conversations, and the question we're exploring today is coronavirus the end of one-size-fits-all treatment, care and planning at the end of life? In our previous Important Conversation events, we've established that this pandemic is proving to be a watershed moment in terms of death and dying. It's also a moment in which already established health inequalities are becoming ever starker. Planning ahead is a key way in which people can consider and document their priorities and values at the end of life. When someone shares their wishes, it means that health and care professionals can provide the personalised care that's right for them as an individual. Simply put, planning ahead helps people to have a good death by ensuring that decisions are made with them, not for them. Coronavirus has meant that people who are already at risk of health inequalities may now be even less likely to be able to consider their wishes for the end of life, and subsequently less likely to experience a good death. We know that many communities who experience health inequalities also face additional barriers, such as structural racism, which can prevent people from accessing mainstream support. In addition, language barriers and lower levels of health literacy mean that some communities are less likely than the wider population to be able to document their wishes without support. This means that people from certain communities, or who need more help to plan ahead, have a worse experience at the end of life. Today, we'll be looking particularly at the effects of race, gender, learning disability, sexuality, and the social determinants of health on people's ability to make decisions about their care, and therefore to experience a good death. And most importantly, we'll be looking at what can be done about these inequalities. So those are my introductory thoughts, and now a few housekeeping points before we move on to our speakers. First of all, we'll hear from each of our expert panelists who will give us our 5-minute lightning talk. And then at the end of all the talks, we will open up into a discussion in which we encourage you all to ask your questions. Very sadly, Farzana Khan, Director of Healing Justice London, is unable to join us today. So Natalie Koussa will share some reflections on racial inequalities from the perspective of Compassion in Dying's work, engaging with communities. Because we've got lots of attendees today, we can't see you or hear you, but we do encourage you to ask your questions using the Q&A function. And that function will probably be at the bottom of the screen, but it could be somewhere else, depending on what device you're using. I say that as if I understand it, but trust me, I'm a bit of an IT phobe, so it'll be somewhere. We will answer as many of your questions as possible later on in the seminar. And if when you're asking your question, you can try to express it as briefly as possible so that we can get through as many questions as possible. But do let us know your name and what your interest in death and dying is. We've disabled the chat function because we've got so many attendees, but the Compassion in Dying team may post some messages there for you to see. And if you'd like to share your thoughts on social media, please do. And the hashtag is #ImportantConversations. So without further ado, I would like to start the lightning talks by our expert panelists. And I'd like to introduce, first of all, Rebecca Manson-Jones. Rebecca is spokesperson for Equal Health for the Women's Equality Party. And Rebecca has got personal experience, which she will share with us, of caring for a loved one at the end of life. She's going to explore the issues faced by women at the end of life, both in dying and as an informal carer, and she'll reflect on the policy changes that need to happen to make end-of-life care better for women. Rebecca, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm going to attempt some of that. I'm Rebecca. I'm also a candidate for the Women's Equality Party and the Equal Health Spokesperson. We have one mission: to create equality, which is better for everyone. And we have 7 objectives on which we campaign, of which 2 are health and care. We're campaigning for a caring culture that invests in the caring economy. So health, care, social services, education, the environment. We believe that investment in these areas brings more and sustainable benefit to everyone than investment into infrastructure projects alone. And the Women's Budget Group agree with us. My day job, my work for WEP is voluntary, like lots of politics. My day job is as Artistic Director of Spare Tyre, a leading theatre arts charity, and we make work with women who have experience of domestic violence or abuse, people living with dementias, and learning disabled people and artists. So you can see that this session sits across my interests and passions. And as Barbara said, I have been an end-of-life carer for both of my parents at different times. I joined the Women's Equality Party at its outset in 2016, partly informed by the experiences of that very special, challenging and educational time for me, caring for my mother, who out of the blue, a very fit, golf club swinging 78-year-old, was diagnosed with a massive brain tumour 6 months after her much younger sister had died nastily and painfully and furiously, she was furious, of lung cancer. The time was special because my mother showed me and everyone around her how to make a good death. And this was hugely helped by her ability to stare death in the face. She'd made her plans on backs of envelopes, and we had a green file with her medical records and the DNR that she herself had set up. And these were all kept together by the telly. It was challenging because we had no idea what was in front of us, and getting support where we lived, and because we knew nothing, was very difficult. My father was 84, he was disabled by a knee replacement that had gone wrong, and he needed a lot of help that he didn't want to admit to or ask for. He'd been an ocean racer, he was the captain in charge, and he'd been an engineer, so he couldn't understand that the doctors couldn't fix the love of his life. It was educational for me because I learned from the carers when we did get them, in community nursing, in social care, and a hospice at home team. They were all excellent, and a whole world was opened up to me. So for my mother, dying at home was the only option, and we ended up doing it really well, and we're very glad that we had. With my father 5 years later, it was an entirely different case. He was a different person. That's the most important thing. He was just a different person. He was a different gender, which was a big factor. It was a different illness. He had different status because of his social situation, his life history, and the fact that he'd run the finances all his life. He also had severe memory loss and was a total optimist, so he was completely unable to accept what was happening. I was gobsmacked that the hospital doctors did a DNR with him without any of us present, and I don't think my dad ever consented or understood that. And in his last week, it became quite difficult to decide what to do. I knew that he would hate and not benefit from some cardiac intervention at that point, and if he had survived it, he might have got COVID. I negotiated very hard to keep him at home with the doctors. I mean, he was known as Lazarus. He'd outlived what they expected him to do, so you can see why there was some dilemma. And in the end, he died peacefully in his sleep at home with the sound of birdsong and the sea, and he was ready. And I'm very lucky to be able to tell you that story, I think, because many women carers and the people they're caring for don't get that. Many women are having to fit these things in around working, around children, around partners. I sadly don't have children. I have a brilliant partner who let me move back in and didn't make a sound about that. And many women are trapped in this increasingly, both societal and increasingly state expectations of caring roles. And there is very little statutory support for them regarding time away from work. And carers allowance is a very bad joke. And clouding all of this is that although we live longer, women, in some parts of the UK, our life expectancy is actually going backwards. Women live longer in ill health than men. And when we all get to the end of life, those gender tropes that confine women and men meet in this kind of bottleneck. So whilst we know that women are more likely to have a plan, they're able to open up about what they want and have their social networks around them, they may be denied the wishes that they know they want by whoever's holding the purse strings and their sense of gatekeeping. or their pain may be dismissed, so they're getting late diagnoses. They can't enact the plans that they would like to have. And these late diagnoses have been dogging them throughout their lives. Men, on the other hand, who spent decades not speaking about their feelings because of their social standing, are suddenly expected to be able to, or are offered activities that enable all that side, but they've no vocabulary or taste for it by now. Men and women need very different things to cope with the process of going through death because of the gender segregated lives that we live. And I know that some of the other speakers are going to speak about the nature of specialist care and the intersection of bespoke approach that's vital. And it's absolutely, even in my family situation, I could see that. My mother's friends and how she chose to interact with people. For my father, all the things that he needed were about continuing his social life as far as we could, so he didn't even really need to think about it all. And he carried on living a good life whilst he was dying. And I'd learned that from the first time around, how important that would be. So for me, the solution and what we need to be looking at a policy level is that when I say we, I mean governments, I mean social policy makers, you need to understand care, value it, and then invest in it. And what that would look like is, because this work has largely been done by charities and women, paid and unpaid, its complexity and its richness is completely overlooked. And that's why society and government don't value it. So what we need to see, Women's Equality Party, we're calling for a programme of training and respect for the caring professions, a real understanding of how rich and intricate the roles can be, a professional pay scale with progression routes, and an ability to help people, families and the people who are dying, to reconnect with that process of living whilst dying, for it to be a part of family life, like bringing up a baby is. So therefore, we then need a parity of esteem and support for family carers, which sort of is equivalent and equates to that we are also campaigning for equal parental leave. So all of this will require a shift in our public funding mentality, because we've already proven, and COVID has really given us the moment to shine a light, we've already proven who the key workers are in our society, but we're very quickly in danger of slipping back to where we were before. So this COVID moment, it's borrowing your line, Barbara, but the COVID moment really could and should be a watershed moment from which there can be no turning back. I hope that's enough to get going.
Barbara, you're on mute, but I think you might be saying it's my turn.
There we go. Thank you very much, Rebecca. And I thought that was incredibly powerful about the need for us to value and invest in care, both on a professional level and also on an informal carer level. And it's government has struggled with it for a long time now, so this is the moment. I'd now like to introduce Tor Butler-Cole QC, who's a barrister at 38 Essex Chambers. And she's going to reflect on the inequalities experienced by people with learning disabilities at the end of life, and share some thoughts on how the Mental Capacity Act can help to ensure that people with learning disabilities are supported to make their own decisions about their end-of-life care, so they can receive truly person-centred care based on health and care professionals' knowledge of their personal values and priorities. So Tor, please.
Thanks, Barbara. So if you know anything at all about people with learning disabilities and healthcare, then you will know that there is a massive systemic problem in this country with the quality of and adequacy of medical care and treatment which people with learning disabilities receive. And it has been known about for a very long time, and there are specific programs in place to monitor the problem, to write reports about it, to issue guidance and recommendations, and to try and fix it. And they've all been going on for quite some time as well. And the scale of the problem is, when you first hear about it, it's incredible. You might think, oh well, perhaps there's a bit of a problem, or I can see that there might be some difficulties providing care to people who have extra needs. When you actually look at it and learn that gaps in life expectancy of many, many years between people with learning disabilities and those who don't have learning disabilities. The scale of it is truly shocking. And in last year's government response to the Lader report, the figures that they used were a gap in median life expectancy for women with learning disabilities of 27 years and for men of 23 years. And that is, those figures are so huge and so extraordinary that you can't really believe that that's still the case, that we've known about it for years and years and years, and yet we still have those sorts of appalling figures in these reports. And the problems are known about and the issues are raised every time. They're not new, different ones, they're the same ones. There's failures in communication, there's failures in planning, there's a lack of understanding of the legal framework that permits people to make decisions on behalf of people who don't have mental capacity to do that for themselves. All of these problems are flagged up time and time again. And there's then guidance and further reminders and training given to people about how to deal with them. And so just last spring, there was a specific query and problem flagged up by this monitoring system about the use of learning disability as a reason for imposing a do not attempt resuscitation order on a person. Now, you would think that in 2019, you wouldn't need to explain to the health professions that you don't use learning disability as a reason for a do not resuscitate order, because how could that possibly be appropriate? And yet that's the problem that had been thrown up as occurring still, even in 2019, which resulted in the Department of Health and Social Care saying that they were going to issue yet more guidance about it, and that the head of NHS England and NHS Improvement would write to senior doctors and explain to them that this wasn't acceptable. So that was last spring. And then the pandemic has come along, and what has it shown us? It's shown us that all of those fears that people had about the lack of equitable access to healthcare for people with learning disabilities were rightly held, because the pandemic comes along and we discover that this guidance and this training hasn't worked. There are still blanket do not resuscitate notices being suggested in various locations, not just as a one-off problem. There's still a need for the Care Quality Commission and others to put out guidance reminding people once again that a do not resuscitate order is not something that you do on the basis of who someone is or where they live or what kind of care they receive. It's not a sort of a blanket decision. And worse than that, perhaps, you have NICE, who are the professional body who are required to provide guidance on medical treatment issues, issuing a guideline about access to intensive care during the pandemic, which discriminates against people with learning disabilities by using a scale for assessing people's likelihood of benefiting from intensive care that was not designed to be used in learning disabled people, and if applied to them would be completely wrong. Now, some of those problems, if not all of them, were fixed. It was flagged up that the NICE guideline was completely unlawful and actually, frankly, just stupid, because it used a scale which was not validated in the whole population and assumed that it was. And that guideline was then changed and rewritten to make clear that it was wrong and that that wasn't the approach that should be taken. And the blanket do not resuscitate orders were retracted, and people were reminded that those were individual decisions to be made in consultation with the patient and their family, not to be done on the basis of a standard letter sent out to every resident of a care home. And so you could see that these problems were picked up and dealt with. But if you had any interest in this area, what you could also see was that your worst fears were realised, that these ideas of equality and of taking into account people with different needs are just not embedded in the systems that they should be embedded in. For NICE to produce a guideline which is just wrong and discriminatory like that is outrageous. Okay, it's a pandemic, people are doing things quickly, but if these principles of equitable access were properly embedded, those sorts of mistakes would not be made. And that is really worrying, because we've got so far down this path, and yet these fundamental mistakes are still being made. And they reveal, I think, that the extent of these systemic problems. And then the response to these problems being flagged up, and this may be a slightly false impression that I have, because I spend far too much time on Twitter. But a lot of the responses were, oh, well, that's just a one-off. It was only one care home. It was only one CCG who sent those letters. Or a more patronising response, which was, well, if you actually understood what the likelihood of chances of success were of CPR outside a hospital setting, then you'd realise that everyone needs a do not resuscitate order, and you wouldn't be so bothered about it. And none of those responses properly grapple with these systemic problems and the underlying unfairness and inequity which is there. And that then makes it even worse, because you're now looking in terms of this webinar and the topics that we're thinking about, of this question of how to make sure that people with learning disabilities, like everyone else, get to have a system where they can make advanced care plans for themselves, and perhaps with more input from their families and others than those of us without learning disabilities might need, but perhaps not. How do we get them to be able to benefit from the good things that advanced planning can bring in circumstances where they don't yet have access to adequate medical care at a really basic level? And last year, the LADA report found that of the deaths of people with learning disabilities that they looked at as part of that system, that fewer than 50% of the people involved who had died had received care that was that either met or exceeded the requirements of good practice. If you can't even get more than half of people having good practice applied to them, you do really wonder how on earth you can then move on to looking at something as difficult, sensitive and person specific as advanced care planning in relation to the end of life. And it seems to me that there's really two sort of possible responses to all of this that are probably equally valid. One, I think, is just to say, do you know what, until we can actually get to a society where people with learning disabilities get proper healthcare on a par with everyone else, forget end-of-life advanced care planning, because we have got so far to go on keeping people alive when they are entitled to treatment that we don't really have the resources and the time to focus on planning for the end of life. And as I say, I think that's an entirely valid response, and one that I completely understand. I think another possible response is to say, actually, advanced planning is one of the things that is a problem in relation to healthcare provision to people with learning disabilities generally, not in relation to end of life, but just in getting the healthcare to them that they require. And so, is there some way in which the idea of advanced planning, which is something that people with learning disabilities could really benefit from generally, can be brought together with advanced planning that also encompasses end-of-life decisions for people where that is a relevant consideration? And perhaps the expertise and knowledge that there already is about advanced care planning in the end-of-life field could be brought to bear in relation to medical treatment that people with learning disabilities need. It's not about refusing treatment or end-of-life arrangements, but just getting access to treatment when they require it. And an obvious example is someone with a learning disability who might, in an emergency, need to be taken to hospital, but who has a fear of ambulances or a fear of hospitals, and there's no obvious way to persuade them to go. What can happen, and I've seen this in cases that I've been instructed in, is that nothing happens because it's too difficult and no one knows what the answer is. And yet if there'd been an advanced plan that the person's GP was contacted, that arrangements could be made for a mild sedative to be given so that the person could go to hospital and receive the treatment that they needed, their life might have been saved. And so it seems to me that another possible, slightly less depressing response to all of this is to say, actually, advanced planning itself is something good. There is a lot of expertise in the end-of-life sector about it, and maybe there is something to be done drawing that together with advanced planning generally in the specific context of people with learning disabilities, that might not only mean that the benefits of end-of-life planning are given to people with learning disabilities, but also might actually improve this other hugely fundamental problem that they face, which is actually just getting access to the basic medical treatment which they're entitled to. So those are my thoughts, and I will look forward to discussing them with everyone shortly.
Thank you, Tor. Oh dear. That was both depressing and inspiring. Depressing because the systemic logjam has been going on for such a long time, but inspiring because you really are suggesting, I think, something that could begin to unlock that logjam, and I'm sure people will want to discuss your ideas. I'd now like to introduce Dallas Pounds, who's Chief Executive at Trinity Hospice. And Dallas is going to reflect on her pioneering work at Trinity to consider how hospices and other end-of-life care settings can improve access to personalised end-of-life care for LGBTQ+ people, and what needs to change to ensure that people from these communities have a good death. Dallas.
Thank you, Barbara, and good afternoon, everybody. I think the first thing that I'd like to say as way of background is that the fear of death and dying, the taboo of death and dying in our society is the same for all of us, whether we meet the heteronormative societal view or whether we are part of the LGBTQAI and the alphabet spaghetti soup can go on communities. We are scared of our own mortality. We are not great at talking about death and dying, and that is no different for this group than any other group of society. But what we need to be mindful of is that when you are part of the LGBTQ+ community, you have some additional layers of consideration to be made. And the first thing we have to think about is there actually is quite a lack of data on how many people in the community do fit into the LGBTQ+ population. So that is one thing I think we're always calling for is better data, and maybe the census of 2021, if it goes ahead, will give us that. But we need to remember we're an ageing population, and therefore the LGBT community is an ageing population as well. So a lot of the people that we are talking about death and dying with have lived through Section 28. They have lived through times where being their true self has been illegal, and that they have been, threatened with jail, etc. for that. And the other thing we have to remember is that one bad story lives forever, doesn't it? So these stories of poor treatment in healthcare are passed down almost from generation to generation and through the communities. So we are dealing with history and we are dealing with rhetoric. And you'd like to think, wouldn't you, that LGBT communities are fabulously supportive of each other, but that simply isn't the case. LGBT people are still as likely as other people in ageing to be living in isolation, but more likely to be living without family members to support them or a close community around them. So we are dealing with people who are living in isolation as well. We're also dealing with a group who, because of their fears of discrimination, but also because of practical reasons and poor information from health colleagues, are likely to get later diagnosis. They're less likely to go to screening. I myself, as a gay woman, was told I didn't need cervical screening because I was gay, and I'm not the only person in the country to have experienced that. So there is, this whole issue with late screening as well because of the fear of discrimination in accessing healthcare. And what we also need to remember is that LGBTQ+ are not a homogenous group. LGB, it's about sexual preference. The T is about gender identity. So even within LGBTQ and plus, there are so many different people and so many different individual values. So there's a burgeoning amount of research coming out from Cecily Saunders Institute, King's College, Marie Curie, Compassion in Dying have also done some great work looking at LGBT, to say that actually this is a very individualized experience for this group and that we do need to treat people as individuals. And that is what it all comes down to for me. We're talking about individuals regardless of their sexual preference or their gender identity. And I think one of the big issues for us is that we need to be brave and ask the questions. I'm a nurse by background and I'm CEO at Trinity now, and I know how difficult it is to ask about sexual preference and gender identity. But we have no issues talking about bowel movements and things of that nature. So I think one of the issues for us as a society is not only do we need to get better at talking about death and dying, we need to get better about talking about sexual preference and gender identity as well. So what can we do? What have we done at Trinity, and what do I think that care providers can do? Well, I think you have to start by really looking at yourselves and deciding whether or not you do have an unconscious bias or unconscious barriers in your organisation, not only to people accessing your services, but also to staff coming to work with you. So you really do need to take an honest look at yourselves, and you need to think about your messaging, your use of images, your communications, but also the environment. You know, do you have non-binary, non-gender specific toilets, waiting areas and changing rooms? Does your environment have small queues? Are your staff wearing the rainbow lanyards or the badges or that sort of thing? Do you have other queues around the place? Do you have LGBT posters? Do you have rainbows anywhere? So it's about environment as much as messaging. And I think you also have to think hard about the sessions that you're doing. I myself have witnessed an art therapy session where it was very reminiscent, but the sort of talking was very much about husbands and wives and male stereotypes and female stereotypes. So we have to get away from thinking about things in a binary way and think about things as individuals. And the use of pronouns, of course, is quite big at the moment in healthcare, whether it's he, she, they, them, ze. So we do need to think about that. But the key here also is to ask, be brave and ask the question, because believe me, people from the community will tell you what the answer is. But it's more than that. It's about health and social care agencies reaching out into these communities, linking up with the local LGBT forum, going to talk to this group, hearing what they think about us as end-of-life providers, but also us telling them, you know, dispelling some of the myth and magic, I guess, around hospices has been really, really valuable for us. I quite often go to the over 50s group, the LGBT forum, to talk to them about advanced care planning and will writing and the practicalities of death and dying. And it amazes me every time I go, the incredible questions that I get asked, and actually the lack of knowledge that they have about hospices and palliative care and end-of-life care planning. But if we're going to think about people accessing our services, we also need to think about the people that are working for us. And I think it's incredibly important that everybody that works for me, everybody that works in healthcare, can bring their authentic self to work. Because I believe that the authentic self provides authentic care and values individuals. So you must work with other agencies and find ways to express your support of the LGBT community. And for Trinity, that has looked like walking at Pride, for instance, marching at Pride, and now other hospices have joined us in doing that. But it is a two-way street. This isn't all about providers reaching out to the LGBT community. This is also about the LGBT community being more willing to interact with healthcare providers and trusting that one poor story doesn't tar all healthcare providers with the same brush. I think that coronavirus has brought communities together in an incredible way. People standing out on the streets, doing hand clapping, people having distant street parties in a way that they haven't done before. And I truly hope that that has embraced LGBT communities out there as well. If we can hang on to that sense of community spirit, which I think is alive and kicking in some places now, I do believe that that will help us address people as individuals and be more accepting and a little bit braver in providing end-of-life care to everybody that needs it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dallas, and thank you for reminding us not only to be braver ourselves in our interactions, but also braver about our institutions. I think that's really important. And now I'd like to introduce Natalie, Natalie Koussa, who's Director of Community Engagement and Partnerships at Compassion in Dying. And Natalie's going to share learning from our community engagement work, including the impact of inequalities at individual and community levels on people's ability to get the treatment and care that's right for them as an individual at the end of life. So, Natalie.
Thanks, Barbara. So from Compassion in Dying's perspective, we're seeing the ways in which already existing inequalities are being exacerbated by the pandemic and the impact of this on people's ability to make decisions about their treatment and care, which of course in turn negatively impacts the likelihood of them having a good death. we're seeing the compounding impact of loads of factors. So things like isolation, digital exclusion, poverty and racial inequalities on the people who need our services the most. And simultaneously, we're also seeing that middle-class white British people are still planning ahead at the same level, if not more, since the pandemic started. I and we don't think this is okay, so we're taking action to be more inclusive. This inequality is manifesting in several ways. With the options for face-to-face support being taken away, we're seeing a drop-off in the use of services designed specifically to support people to make decisions. In fact, many of the people who want to access our community support are telling us that they prefer to wait until they can meet somebody face-to-face, rather than go ahead and have the conversation by phone or online. And for some people, this is because of specific communication needs. So for instance, they may have fluctuating capacity with early onset dementia, or for others, it's because they want to build a relationship with the person supporting them and they don't feel that that's possible over the phone. Many of the people we support have experienced the pandemic as a crisis. They've been struggling to cover even the basic necessities. Simple everyday things like getting their food shopping has become a struggle. And so they just simply haven't had the headspace to consider making decisions about their treatment and care. And what we're also seeing through our services is that white middle-class people are more likely to still be able to plan ahead. So we're seeing that people from Black and minority ethnic communities are much harder hit by the pandemic, both in terms of accessing advanced care planning services, but also in their lives more broadly. The pandemic has also impacted our partner organisations, many of which are small community organisations, which have switched to providing crisis support, rather than providing their more usual ongoing support. And the impact of this is that vital services that help people make decisions about the end of life are being ripped away at a time when some need them most. I've actually seen the interplay between COVID-19 and entrenched racial inequalities described as a double pandemic, which I think demonstrates the severity of the situation we find ourselves in. So what needs to be done? Well, there is work going on, including by some of the wonderful people on this panel and our colleagues. And yet it's clear that there's so much more work to do to ensure equal access to the support needed to have a good death. So I'd like to share 3 distinct but interrelated examples of the ways in which we at Compassion in Dying are working to reduce inequalities, with the hope that in sharing these examples, we may enable others, so that's you watching, to take simple, impactful steps to ensuring that we all have a good death, regardless of our gender, ethnic background, the conditions in which we live, or any other aspect of our identity or life experience. For each, I'll suggest an action we can take, and then I'll illustrate it to show how this could look in practice. So firstly, I think that we should be focusing on meeting community needs and not just individual needs. Compassion in Dying, in partnership with Healthwatch Lambeth, is currently leading Lambeth's Advanced Care Planning Consortium. The consortium trains local people to provide one-to-one support to other local people to make and document decisions about their future treatment and care. When we were planning this project, we worked alongside people from communities the project supports, community organisations, the local authority, CCG, and local hospice, to understand how health inequalities are experienced by people in these distinct communities. Through this extensive collaboration, we designed a project which supports diverse local communities, all of whom we know experience health inequalities. These communities are informal carers, people with learning disabilities, people with multiple long-term conditions, people with dementia, and people from Lambeth's large Portuguese-speaking communities. Although diverse, these communities have in common, firstly, that they're more likely to be able to access support, and even when they do, they're less likely to be able to access support, and even when they do, they're more likely to have a poor experience. So for instance, we hear about people not even understanding their prognosis because there wasn't an interpreter present for that conversation. And secondly, there are well-established local organisations with strong relationships to people from these communities on which to build. So crucially, the support that this project provides is new, but the relationships on which it is built are well established. It's an approach I think other areas can take too. We can begin to make significant progress to reduce inequalities at the end of life by working in partnership with communities and moving beyond an individualistic understanding of people's experiences. So my second overarching message is that we shouldn't forget to maximise strengths. During the pandemic, we at Compassion in Dying have seen firsthand that when community peer-led support to plan for the end of life is already established, then people within that community still continue to consider and document their end of life wishes and to access the support available. For instance, Stockwell Partnership is a community organisation which is led by and supports people from Lambeth's Portuguese-speaking communities. The support the partnership provides to help people consider their end-of-life wishes has been well established and has been running for nearly 2 years, so well before the pandemic. And the project has seen almost no reduction in demand for help to document end-of-life wishes. I've got a lovely explanation of why this is from Gustavo, their project worker. So bear with me, I'm going to read this because he's expressed it really nicely, so I want to get it right. So he says, when there's really good support that is integrated into our community and delivered by people the community know and trust, then a crisis like this can be easier to deal with because the support people need is already on their doorstep and they know where to find it. My community has been able to keep planning for the end of life because there is the right local support without the need for an interpreter, and talking about dying has already been normalised. And thirdly and finally, support is better delivered if it comes from within the person's own community. So it's well documented that people from Black and minority ethnic communities are less likely than white British people to access services, and they're also less likely to rate them as excellent when they do access them. We know that the majority of people that call Compassion in Dying's information line are white British. So our community engagement work is specifically designed to include people that we wouldn't otherwise reach. A few examples of our community engagement work include: we worked with a group of older Somali women in East London to develop bespoke planning materials which enable them to make their wishes known. We're currently working with Portuguese-speaking communities in Lambeth, as I've mentioned, but the reason for this is that 1 in 6 people in the borough speak Portuguese as a first language, and these communities are known to experience entrenched health inequalities. So we've trained community workers who speak Portuguese to be able to have advanced care planning conversations. They also hold community awareness raising events to get the word out. We've developed bilingual forms, and all conversations take place in that person's first language with somebody who understands their culture. In Lambeth, we're also working with volunteers representative of the communities we're supporting. For instance, we're training people with learning disabilities to provide peer support to others with learning disabilities who want to plan ahead. And this is because we know that it's crucial for services to work well. People need to trust the people supporting them, and people are more likely to trust somebody from their own community who understands their experiences. So at every level, from leadership to delivery, we're supporting people from the particular communities to lead and deliver and support others in their community to be able to plan ahead. So in conclusion, I'd like to encourage all of us working within health and care services, including in voluntary and community organisations, to take a step back and evaluate who may not be included in the support that we provide every day. And then get out there and forge relationships with people in these communities. This simple action has the potential to transform services, to become more inclusive and truly rooted both in the needs and strengths of the communities who may benefit most from our support.
Thank you. Thank you, Nat. Again, a very powerful contribution. And there's something very important about that message, that if we work with communities, we'll not only get there faster, we'll also get there better, because we'll be focusing on the strengths that exist and fostering them. So thank you. We're now going to move on to opening up our question time. And our first question, I'm going to direct it to you initially, Tor, is from Gillian Schiller, who's chairman of the Board of Trustees at St Luke's Hospice in Harrow and Brent. Are our failures with people with learning disabilities and the fact that they're dying early mirrored in other countries? Do we have learning from elsewhere that could help us reduce this gap and treat everyone better?
That's a really good question. I don't know anything in great detail about similar statistics or similar programs in other countries. I'm sure there will be some of that data out there. And of course, no doubt there'll be countries that are doing even worse than we are, although it's hard to imagine that when you think about those statistics. So I don't know. There may well be. I think one of the things that is so frustrating so in my day job as a lawyer, when I get involved in cases where these sort of problems have arisen about access to healthcare, is that actually a lot of it doesn't really seem that difficult. You know, the number of people who I come across who have not had access to proper dentistry, for example, because they have a learning disability, and there's specific guidance on the government website about people with learning disabilities and access to dentists. It's all, the guidance is all there, but it doesn't really get done. And the people it does get done for, the people who happen to have a very committed family member or advocate who can really fight on their behalf for it. But you can't run a system like that, because it can't be that every kind of intervention that you need a massively committed advocate to get it for you. It's got to become, you know, so much more routine than that, because, you know, you can't spend all your effort on dentistry when there are other things that also, you know, someone might need help with accessing. So that, I think that's one of the puzzles of it, is that it's not that difficult to see what it is that needs to happen, and that is, I think, why a lot of people reach the view that the only explanation for why it isn't happening is ingrained prejudice in the system, because otherwise you would think this could be something that could be sorted out. But I do think that, as I was saying, that because planning in the end of life context is such a sort of well established and recognized thing to do, that it's then, if you then compare that to the absence of plans for people with learning disabilities, who clearly would benefit from them, precisely because whatever needs to be arranged for them is slightly out of the ordinary, slightly different to what normally happens, and so it does need a bit of advanced thought, otherwise everything takes forever or just simply doesn't happen. That there is that good practice that we already have here in a slightly different context that could be linked together to try and improve it all round.
Can you hear me now? Good. Okay, this is for Rebecca. We've had a couple of similar questions I want to scoop up into one, and it's about the emphasis we often see on dying at home as a measure of a good death. Oh, this is interesting. Do panelists think that this emphasis puts unfair pressure on women, as they're most likely to be informal carers for loved ones? Is it creating social pressure on women to ensure their loved ones have a good death? And Rebecca, if we can throw this one to you first, and then I'll open it up.
Yes, you absolutely can. I don't know whether there's an emphasis on dying at home as an indicator of a good death. I do know that in my family, what I'm expert in, that was part of it. And that was partly because my mother's parents both had terrible deaths in the same hospital, and she had an absolute fear of that. So talking about sort of being within your own community, I'm an expert on my family, and I knew that's what my mother wanted. She expressly said it. She absolutely wanted to be there. She loved having everyone around, in and out of all of that. So for her, that was absolutely part of it. And knowing that she was going to be supported and safe in that helped her then take her leave of everybody and all of those things. But we all knew that were there a situation where she would have benefited from being in hospital, we would have done that. Secondly, in the sense of, does it put pressure on women? Yes, it probably does. It probably does create work, but in some situations it can save work too, in the sense that if you are in a situation where the distance from the hospital from where you live and you have children at home, or sometimes a hospital death can put more pressure on women because there's more things to do. But I totally see that that situation needs to be taken case by case. It's that I don't think that there should be a hierarchy in this any more than I think that a birth at home or a birth in hospital. It's what you need to do in the time, and being able to have that conversation with the care teams and all of that, and with the family, and just checking out all those and being able to respond to the circumstance that you're in is really, really important. So I wouldn't want to say that a death at home is the best death you can possibly have, because it isn't always. My mother-in-law died in hospital, and that was the best death that she could have had.
Thank you, Rebecca. Nat?
Thanks, Barbara. Two responses to that question. The first is that I think that this interest in measuring place of death is because it's an easy indicator. Which doesn't necessarily make it a good indicator. It's simple to measure where somebody died, but that doesn't in itself tell us about the quality of their death. And I think the second point to make is that it masks other inequalities. So things like social deprivation. So for instance, if you're lucky enough to live in secure housing and you have a comfortable bedroom and space for carers to access a bathroom to support you and so on, then it may be possible for you to have a good death at home, and that may be appropriate for you. But if you live in insecure housing, if you live in overcrowded housing, or if there are others that you live with for whom it would be distressing for you to die at home, then that might not be appropriate. And these are some of the considerations that get masked with this focus on in a kind of blanket sense on place of death, and I think that there's a very strong inequalities strand that absolutely needs to be considered.
Yeah, absolutely.
Death is not necessarily a good death. Dallas, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I totally agree. I think, if you ask society as a whole, when they are not facing their own death imminently, they generally will say to us, we want to die at home, we want to die at home. But I think there's also, Natalie is completely right, there's so many other inequalities about being able to die at home. But I also think we have to be incredibly careful that we don't make the inability to die at home some sort of loss to that family, some sort of weakness, some sort of failure as well, because we all know that things can change within an hour, within a day. So while I think it's important that we talk to people about their preferred place of death, I agree that it is not always a good indicator about the quality of that death.
Thank you, Natalie. I'm going to go on now to an observation for Dallas. This is from Paul Kefford, who's an end-of-life doula and celebrant. Paul says there's another barrier for those from the LGBTQ community, of whom I am one, who live in rural areas and experience a perhaps more intense isolation and homophobic response from healthcare providers. And even when LGBTQ plus issues are looked at, the work is so often mediated through a heteronormative lens. So how can those who identify as LGBTQ plus identify support that can come alongside and be responsive and recognise their experience, rather than having those who come alongside irrespective of identity? People in the LGBTQ plus communities need to be regarded and seen. So Dallas, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, Paul, I couldn't agree with you more. And yes, it is incredibly challenging in rural areas to identify a champion from within an LGBTQ community, let alone an LGBTQ person within a healthcare facility to champion your cause. However, it also does happen right in the centre of London, so the isolation that people feel in London as well. And what I've suggested to people that have contacted me in the past, both hospices that are in rural areas, but also people living in rural areas looking for end-of-life care, is that coming back to that bravery thing again, is to make contact and try and identify somebody within the system who you feel you can trust to be alongside you for that. It is getting better across hospices for sure. I know that because of the number of hospices that do contact me. But all I can say is that I agree, it is incredibly difficult in rural areas to find that support and to find that basic support from our community. And yes, the discrimination can, and the isolation can feel more acute when you're not in a community of mass, of numbers. So I'm afraid I have no magic bullet on that, Paul, other than to absolutely empathise with you, but to say, keep looking for those people, keep searching for them, because I'm sure you will find somebody.
And it's an important comment about rural communities in general. Yes. There's often an enormous amount of hidden deprivation and vulnerability in rural communities. So we need to be mindful of that. Thank you, Paul. That was an interesting observation. So I think this one's probably for Nat, first of all. If we're taking a community approach, how do we take into account the differentiated needs within communities? For example, ethnic, disabled, LGBTQ plus individual needs. Presumably an individual approach is still needed. So this is we're looking at communities. What about the individual?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the key is understanding people in that layered approach as an individual within a wider community. And as the person that's asked this question is rightfully suggested, none of us are within one single community. You know, we have multiple layers to our identity, and the very best care can be given and the very best support to enable people to make their own decisions can be given when those multiple layers are both known about and understood. And I think some of that Dallas has been saying very compellingly about how, kind of asking people to come forward and share something of themselves in order that they can be known. I think that's part of it, and I think that the other part of it is that as workers and designers and policymakers and all of those levels within services, we can become collectively much stronger and much better kind of educated on these different levels, so that each person is met at individual and community level. And it's complex. On one level, it can be relatively simple to identify, so I keep talking about the Portuguese communities in Lambeth, but that's because we're working with them very in depth at the moment. So on one level, there are an obvious community to identify, but even within that, there is not one Portuguese-speaking community in Lambeth. There are people from lots of different Portuguese-speaking communities and countries that come together. So even on those levels, it's about continuing to ask questions, continuing to have conversations with people from communities, and essentially to supporting people from within those communities to both lead and deliver the support on offer.
Thank you, Nat. This isn't a question as such, but it feels like a very powerful reflection from someone called Kathy in response to Rebecca's talk. So Kathy says, to me, it was very important and immensely compassionate to give my father permission to die. Everyone else was telling him, don't talk like that when he spoke of dying. That left him conflicted. He knew it was okay to go, but he felt he was letting others down. And I think that's a really important reflection, isn't it? How our messages impact people and how we can let our own sadness and anxiety get in the way. So thank you for that, Kathy. And now another question, and I think this one is probably for Dallas. You've obviously been amazing, Dallas, you have, at transforming the provision of your services to meet the needs of your local LGBTQ people. But I'm interested in how easy you found it to bring other services providers, clinicians, organisations on board, with the need to be critical about what they do. Do people tend to get it, or are they sometimes reluctant to recognise the need?
God, yeah, what a superb question. I think let's just think about the hospice world to start with, because that's where this kind of started for me. I'm not going to pull any punches, so apologies to hospice colleagues who are on the webinar. But there were Trinity was definitely the first hospice to stick its head above the parapet in a big way about hospices and LGBTQ, and even across London we met resistance. We met resistance from organisations that didn't see it as relevant, didn't think it was required in this day and age, but sadly also organisations that didn't want to be seen to be supporting LGBT people because of either their religious backgrounds or because of their belief systems. And I think, to be honest, I was just tenacious and kept going and kept sort of banging the drum. And the way that I did that was to actually identify that we couldn't, as organisations, claim to be giving individualised, holistic, specialist palliative and end-of-life care if we didn't know the individuals that we were giving that care to. And we didn't support those individuals to be their authentic self and die in the way that was authentic to them as individuals. And that's actually quite a big heart pull, isn't it, to anybody that works in healthcare. But since then, it's been very interesting because a lot of hospices across London have now come together and recognised that we need to be more visible to the LGBT communities, but also in attracting LGBT staff as well. And we have a London network. But interestingly, now, I'm now being asked to go and speak to other agencies. So people like Age UK across London. I did a talk at a local scope as well. I've been to commercial groups as well. I just went to, I did a webinar for some headhunters just last week. So I think people are genuinely interested in the subject. I think you do get recoil when you suggest there might be unconscious bias and organisational discrimination. But I think if you can couch your point in a way that's meaningful to that organisation, generally they come round.
Thank you, Dallas. And also thank you for reminding us that we mustn't see the organisations involved in end-of-life care in specifically healthcare terms. It's much broader than that, and our influence needs to extend throughout the different levels in communities and society. Absolutely, we're part of a wider system and we have to be, mindful of that. Yeah, and end-of-life care isn't just about that last little bit either. It's about how we live our lives as we come to the end of our lives. Okay, so this is a question, first of all, for Tor, and then maybe Nat might like to comment as well. I work with people with severe and enduring mental health difficulties. And I'm wondering if you know of organisations and work looking at supporting some of these people at the end of life. Within our mental health trust, it's quite hard to get staff to even start ACP conversations, as it's not part of their training at all. I'm really glad that mental health has come into our agenda this afternoon. So Tor, would you like to start off with that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because I think that in the mental health context, you have this sort of clash almost of not of perspectives, but of sort of motivating factors. And so if a lot of your time is spent trying to encourage people who might be thinking about self-harm, that's not a good idea, and trying to stop them from harming themselves, then switching from that to a discussion about potentially refusing aspects of medical treatment for a physical health condition can be quite difficult. And it can be quite difficult, I think, to separate out what the legislation recognises as a real possibility, which is that you could make an advanced decision in relation to treatment for a physical health condition, where even though you might not be able to make one in relation to treatment for your mental health condition. And so we have this sort of slightly odd division in the legislative framework, which means that advanced decisions can be made about physical health problems, but not about your psychiatric health problems if you're a detained patient. And I suspect that having that division then means that talking about advanced care planning and advanced decisions at all is sort of off the agenda, and separating out what is treatment for a mental health condition and what is treatment for a physical health condition can be difficult if the two things are related in some way. Having said all of that, if you look at the case law in the Court of Protection, which is where I mainly practice, there are a lot of cases and an increasing number of cases where the courts are making decisions on behalf of people who may or may not have the capacity to do that for themselves about the point at which further invasive treatment would not be a good idea, whether that's for an unrelated physical health condition, so treatment for cancer or something of that sort, or even if it is actually something that is strongly related to the mental health problem, so treatment for anorexia, for example. So you can do all of this, but it's clearly difficult, and I can see that there might be sort of aspects of the system and the framework and the way it works, which makes it particularly difficult in the context of a mental health trust to even sort of raise these conversations and to talk about them, because the legal framework isn't that clear or that obvious, and there could be a tension between, or a perceived tension at the very least, between encouraging people to think about the possibility of refusing treatment, when at the same time you're desperately encouraging them to accept treatment that you're offering to help with the mental disorder that they've been diagnosed with. But I don't know off the top of my head of any specific organisations doing work in that area beyond just giving people general advice about what their rights are in terms of decision making if they're being treated under the Mental Health Act. But I don't know if Natalie might do.
Nat.
I'm afraid I don't know of a specific organisation doing work in that area, but this is something that we hear relatively frequently on our information line, so I can echo a lot of what Tor's been describing. And what we hear is that health and care professionals kind of across the board can be incredibly reluctant to have conversations about stopping treatment, and that where people have mental health problems, it's a complicating factor, so they're sometimes even less likely to be able to get answers, really kind of honest, frank responses to direct questions. And there's also the further barrier that if somebody has enduring mental health problems, then it can call into question their advanced decision if they do refuse treatment in advance using an advanced decision. So where people call our information line asking these kinds of questions, we tend to have a very individualised conversation with them to really understand their circumstances, and where appropriate we might ask them to go and have a conversation with their GP, if they have a relationship that's good enough with their GP, because what the GP can sometimes do is add a note to their advanced decision to say that it's been discussed, they accept that the person has capacity to make these decisions, and although I want to stress that it's not a legal requirement in any way for a healthcare professional to countersign an advanced decision, that's for the person themselves to do, but just in these kinds of circumstances where there can be stigma or misunderstanding or genuine concern about the person's capacity to make decisions, it can be helpful to have a conversation with a GP or another trusted health professional, if there is one that the person has a good enough relationship with.
And maybe it's also just worth mentioning that some hospices have very strong relationships with community psychiatry, and are sometimes able to access advice and sometimes individual support on that basis. And so here's an interesting question. And maybe we'll go to Dallas first, but I'm sure other people would like to chip in. if Matt Hancock was watching this seminar, if only, what one policy change would you like to ask him to make?
Oh, goodness me. Oh, that's a real toughie. That is a real toughie. Do you know what? I'm going to have to answer with the thing that's that I've been up to my neck in this week, and that is that the policies and processes around health funding for end-of-life care and continuing healthcare funding, and to goodness only knows, either make it simpler, get rid of it, make it applicable to all. But I would want changes to continuing healthcare funding, actually.
Amen to that from me. And we do need to remember, you know, that money really matters, and that people having access to funding makes a huge difference. Nat?
There's a queue of us here, aren't there, with our demands. But I just wanted to chip into, I'm sure many people watching are aware, but Kate Masters recently brought a legal challenge to Matt Hancock, which we at Compassion in Dying supported, and it very simply asks for better information to be provided around do not attempt to resuscitate orders. And Kate is somebody that has witnessed firsthand the extremely traumatic impact of DNAR orders not being discussed in ways that people can understand, and the correct information not being given. So that's and to be clear, Matt Hancock has committed to providing information, but we don't yet know what that would look like, and we want it to be comprehensive, public facing, easy to understand. Over to you, Rebecca.
Hello. I could have a list, but I think the overriding one today, and I'm kind of going to plug the John's campaign thing, because access for family members, because I think that we need Matt Hancock to see so that the definition of visitor to a care home that it embraces family, and actually, as the spokesperson for the John's campaign this morning was saying, families aren't visitors, families are family members, and to prevent the deterioration of people who are resident in care homes and not having access to people that they love and recognise. So if we're going to have compassion in dying, actually just being able to be with people, and they've got to find a way through that. So access to better testing and the ability to visit relatives in care homes and make sure that they're not lonely. I think that would be the one thing that I would ask him to change first, and then I've got a list of other things.
Okay, let's let Tor have a go.
It's too difficult. There's too many things on the list, but I think actually I would say something that's actually a little bit similar to what Dallas said, but wider, which is sort out funding for social care, and then people involved in its provision and families and people who use social services would actually have time to look at things like advanced planning and all the other useful things they could be doing, rather than quibbling, arguing, filling in forms and going backwards and forwards, debating how things are going to be paid for and which services are actually going to be provided.
And if I'm allowed one myself, I'd like Matt Hancock to get hold of all his colleagues in the cabinet and reverse the disastrous changes to our social security system and institute a system of social security that's adequate and respectful of people. Okay, so.
That's sorted.
He's got a big job, poor man. What practical things can be done to help health and care professionals be better at understanding diversity? For example, how do we help care professionals understand that next of kin doesn't need to be a specific gender? Or how not to make assumptions about what people want at the end of life based on stereotypes? So it's a broad question. Who'd like to have a go at this one? Yeah, Dallas, please.
It is a broad question, but it's also an ongoing issue and battle. And I've been in and around end-of-life care a long time, and I think, you know, we occasionally take a step forward in this, but we also take steps back as well. I think the biggest thing for me is again that word tenacity, to keep trying, to have brave conversations, to keep raising awareness, to battle on and find different ways of doing that. So multimedia ways of giving messages that this is important. Using stories, I think, is really powerful. And I think Rebecca shared her story today, and you know, stories are an incredibly powerful way to illustrate the importance of getting this right. But I think we have to be creative and we have to be innovative in the ways that we approach people and the ways that we give these messages. And I don't think you can do it too much, but I may be biased, so I'll let somebody else chip in.
We've got several questions on the specifics of engaging different communities, including this one from Ali Dickinson, who's an end-of-life doula. And she says to you, Nat, thank you for your point on interacting with everyone to plan, especially when people are struggling to meet basic needs such as food, housing, heating. Can you say more on how you engaged people in different communities to talk about how they want their end-of-life care to be? So I'm thinking here about specifics. What did you need to do differently to get, for example, the Portuguese community to engage with end-of-life planning? What are the specifics on the how-to?
Yeah, I will. And if I can I be cheeky and just take us back to the previous question, and then I will come on to this. Yeah. Just because I think that there's a really significant opportunity at the moment with primary care networks in terms of training, culture change, having these conversations that we've just been discussing. And what I mean by that is that, so we're working with some primary care networks in Lambeth, Southampton, and in Croydon at the moment. And what we're seeing is that they're providing an opportunity that we certainly haven't had before to bring together the voluntary sector and statutory services, but also people working at different layers within the system. So recently I was at a meeting that had GPs, practice nurse, outreach nurse, link workers, somebody from the PPG, and a receptionist, all in the same room, all getting on the same page about how we were going to embed advanced care planning across that area. And I personally haven't been in meetings at people with every single layer within that service delivery before primary care networks came into being. So I just thought that's it's worth raising, because it's something that others that are watching can also tap into. I think that's a huge opportunity. Thank you. So I think this is an excellent question about what did we actually do differently? You know, what did this look like in practice? So for us, I think there were different stages. The first stage was a really long, I'm going to call it a consultation phase, but it went beyond consultation. It was series of conversations and workshops with different community organisations, bringing together people with different expertise all into the same room, and really trying to understand what are the different both needs and strengths of the particular organisations that we're working with. So the question asked focused specifically on the Portuguese community, so I'll answer to that. But within Portuguese communities in Lambeth, there are specific strengths. So there's this fantastic organisation that I've already mentioned called the Stockwell Partnership, that we're working with in a funded partnership. And there's also a broader network of organisations which aim to improve access to health and care services for people from Portuguese-speaking communities. So with the broader network, we worked from a very early age to raise awareness. So that looked like Compassion in Dying, skilling up Portuguese-speaking people, workers, community workers, to be able to, so that they had the advanced care planning expertise, and then they were able to talk in their first language. We set up and joined community awareness raising activities. This is before the pandemic, so most of them have been face to face. So we were just around in all of the kind of natural touch points within that community, or those communities, which is why this talking about death and dying has become slowly much more normalised. And then in terms of kind of systemic changes, we've done things like make sure that all of the information is bilingual. And the reason we haven't just made it Portuguese is so that it can help to facilitate a conversation with an English speaker if there is an interpreter present. And essentially all of these changes have come through conversation with workers and people we're supporting within Portuguese speaking communities, so that we're able to surface both needs and strengths and to respond accordingly. And that's, in a nutshell, the approach that we take to whichever communities we're working with.
Thank you for that, Nat. And now this is a question for Dallas. As a young queer person, I face less prejudice than older generations, but I worry that my care is still seen through a heteronormative lens. How important is it for queer people to proactively tell healthcare professionals about their sexuality, gender identity, to make sure that they get the care that's right for them?
Mm. That's a great question and good observation, and I truly hope, because you are of a younger generation, you are experiencing less discrimination than some of your older members of your community, although I know it's not true for everybody. And I think it comes back to what I said at the end of my lightning talk. We need to make this a two-way street. People in health and social care agencies need to be willing to have those conversations with everybody that comes to them for care and support. But we as a community, we as individuals within our communities also have to be brave enough to state our identity, our preferences, and enter into those conversations. And sometimes it does feel really brave to do that, to come out, to say to a health professional that you're seeking care from, actually, I'm queer. They may not even know what queer means, so you may then have to explain to them what queer means. But I think we have to make this a two-way street, so that the healthcare professional, the social care professional, whoever that is prepared to listen and to understand, and also be understood as to what is on offer and what can be offered. But we in the community need to also be in having those conversations as well, because I don't know whether you've experienced this, but I've certainly experienced this, that the sooner you come out, the better it seems to be for the outcome, and the longer you don't come out and the longer your sexual preference or your gender identity is assumed as being heteronormative, the more difficult it becomes, because then you get people being a bit embarrassed that they either didn't cotton on, or they didn't realise, or they've said something really stupid or maybe offensive. So I think it really does come down to both us in the communities, the LGBTQ plus communities, being bold enough to be upfront about it, but also going back to other questions, the training and the awareness raising of people that are on the other side of that table, to be accepting, to be honest, to say, do you know what, I'm really not sure what queer means, tell me about how that affects your needs. I hope that it is getting better. I hope that the younger generation will feel braver than perhaps my generation or the generation before me. So yeah, good luck. But I would say be brave, be bold, know what you want, ask for the information to make, good decisions for yourself, and go for it. And if you need an advocate or someone to go with you, then find somebody you trust.
Thank you. I think we've got time, if we're quick, to squeeze one last one in. So I'm going to direct this at you, Nat, and it's a lightning answer. How wide is the gap, and I think there's been quite a few questions that look a bit like this, between ordinary people and those working in end-of-life care? How do you think the power imbalance between patients and doctors impacts on a one-size-fits-all approach at the end of life? Do some people or some communities have less power than others when it comes to their health?
Okay, lightning answer, yes. Some people do have significantly less power than others. And I think if I had to summarise it in kind of one theme, summing up what we hear is that some healthcare professionals essentially think they know best. And we hear too much practice that is about decisions being made for people rather than with them. And the less closely aligned you are to being well educated, white, middle class, the more likely you are to have decisions made on your behalf, and the less likely those decisions are to be the ones that you would have made for yourself.
Thank you, Nat. That's a powerful way for us to begin to close this meeting. And I'd like to say thank you. We've had loads and loads of questions, and we haven't been able to get through them all. But thank you for posing them, and we may well find some bloggy way of picking up on some more of them. I hope that what we've said has inspired us. It's clearly time for a more ambitious and purposeful rethink of how our healthcare system supports dying people to ensure that a person's gender, ethnicity, sexuality, learning disability, socioeconomic background doesn't impact the care that they receive and their right to get a good death. In this discussion, I think we've gone beyond, which is what we often do, simply re-establishing the challenges. We've proposed some simple, achievable actions that we can take to ensure that people are enabled to make their own decisions, that they receive the support they need from services that are responsive and personalised, and that they are ultimately respected as the authority on the treatment and care that's right for them as an individual. And the word brave has been used quite a bit this afternoon, and I'd like to think that we're all going to be brave enough as we leave this webinar to make a commitment to better understanding the impact of diverse identities and experiences of the individuals that we seek to support, whatever their background or identity, so that they're able to get the care, and indeed all of us get the care that's right for us, and to experience a good death that's in line with our personal values and priorities. I just want to say that if anyone has been personally affected by any of the issues that have been raised in this webinar, we will post some sources of support on the chat function. Our mental and emotional health really matters, and we need to take that seriously for ourselves as well as for the people we seek to support. On that note, I would like to thank you all for your contributions, to thank our panelists especially for their thoughtful talks and for answering questions that they didn't know were going to come. Thank you, everybody, and stay safe. Thank you.